The Battle of Lesnaya was one of the major battles of the Great Northern War. It took place on September 28, 1708, September 29, 1708, October 9, 1708, between a Russian army of 18,000 regulars and an unknown number of irregulars commanded by the Princes Repnin and Menshikov, and a Swedish force of around 12,000 men, under the command of General Adam Ludwig Lewenhaupt, at the village of Lesnaya, located close to the border between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Russia. The Swedes were escorting a supply column of 4,500 wagons, needed by their army in the Ukraine. Background: the early Swedish victory at Humlebäck took Denmark out of the war. The decisive Battle of Narva in 1700 hampered major Russian war efforts for several years. Charles XII then focused on the remaining major threat from Poland-Saxony for several years. Meanwhile, Peter the Great rebuilt his army into modern form, concentrating on infantry trained to use linear tactics and modern firearms properly. Sweden only left smaller forces in Estonia and Livonia. Following the fall of Nyenskans in 1703 and Dorpat in 1704, Peter established the city of St. Petersburg in Ingermanland. Following the Treaty of Altrandstadt, where August the Strong of Saxony finally had to sue for peace and resign the Polish throne to Stanislaw Leszczynski, Charles XII decided to launch an assault on Moscow from his campaign base in Poland to force the Russian army into a decisive battle. Lewenhaupt, one of Sweden's foremost generals, was the commander of the Swedish forces in Livonia. In the summer of 1708, King Charles ordered him to march southward with most of the Swedish forces in Livonia and link up with the main army of 25,000 men, based in Poland. Lewenhaupt was to bring a fresh supply of ammunition and food to support the Swedish army in a proposed march on the Russian capital of Moscow. However, Lewenhaupt found that gathering the needed supplies and preparing the army for an overland march took longer than expected, and on September 26, after waiting for Lewenhaupt for weeks, Charles XII abandoned his camps and decided to invade Ukraine, hoping to reach that rich granary before winter. At the time, Lewenhaupt was only about 80 miles from Charles's position. Having observed these movements, Peter decided to attack Lewenhaupt's smaller force before Charles could support it. Menshikov moved quickly to intercept Lewenhaupt's force and prevented it from crossing the Soj River to safety. Lewenhaupt's convoy. In early April 1708, the governor of Riga, Adam Ludwig Lewenhaupt, visited Charles XII at the Royal Army's winter quarters in Radoskivica to discuss strategy and receive orders for the ongoing campaign against Russia. Here he was instructed to obtain a large amount of supplies and wagons that could be sufficient for the main army for about 3 weeks. Once having collected the supplies, Lewenhaupt would assemble as much men as possible from the area, without leaving the garrisons completely stripped. Lewenhaupt would then use these troops to escort the convoy and rendezvous with Charles's main army at Mogilev in early August. In May same year, Lewenhaupt returned to Riga in order to complete the task, which proved far from easy. The Netherlands had suffered many campaigns in the years of the Great Northern War, and so much was drained of needed resources. In early June, the column, of which Lewenhaupt was gathering, was ordered to start campaigning to reach Charles XII in Mogilev, according to schedule. However, the convoy was nowhere ready to leave because of the difficulties assembling it. Only in the beginning of July it was ready, having then suffered 3 to 4 weeks behind the schedule, and a significant shortage of men proved unable to make it to Charles's army before September. On the march turned out slower than expected. Torrential rain turned the roads into mud. Streams became overflooded, which turned out to be a major task to cross, and so, unfortunately for Lewenhaupt and Charles, the expected time of arrival kept moving back. However, after several weeks of waiting and no words heard from Lewenhaupt, There was a twist to the plans as Charles found his position in Mogilev unsustainable and instead on September 26, decided to abandon his camps and march south towards Siberia in Ukraine, hoping to reach that rich granary before winter. During this time Lewenhaupt was about 135 kilometers away from Charles, and on September 28, he received new orders to rendezvous at Starodub and started marching south himself. His convoy passed between Mogilev and Gorky, heading for Propoysk on the river Soj. By October 3, Lewenhaupt had crossed the Dnieper and headed south. The crossing itself has to be considered a military masterpiece. Having observed these movements, Peter I dispatched an army under Boris Sheremetyev after Charles and gathered a force of his own to intercept with Lewenhaupt. The Russians made contact with Lewenhaupt's convoy on October 6, and immediately started harassing it, forcing the Swedes to march in defensive formation across difficult terrain while the numbers of shadowing Russian troops steadily grew. Skirmish at Belitsa. Peter I, who overestimated the Swedish force being 16,000 men strong, had gathered numbers slightly superior to those of Lewenhaupt and was eager to catch his convoy while it was still out of reach of Charles's main army and safety. He planned to destroy the convoy before its crossing of the river Soj, where it would otherwise reach, as Peter thought, the protection of the main army. On October 8, the Russians in the area were large enough that they posed a considerable threat to the convoy, and so the two sides confronted each other for some time at the village of Belitsa. Subsequently, however, Lewenhaupt ordered a cavalry attack consisting of 4,000 men on the equally numbered Russian dragoons who were facing them. The Russian horse did not desire a fight and instead started retreating, persecuted by their enemies for a good 4 kilometers step. In this encounter losses amounted to about 50 Russians and 3 to 4 wounded Swedes. A real battle did not develop as both sides parted, and the confrontation ended with the quick cavalry skirmish. Later the same day, Lewenhaupt reached the small village of Lesnaya and was within a day's march from Propoysk. By now he knew that Peter I was in the area with a fairly large amount of Russian troops, but he did not know exactly how large the Russian army was or if more units were on their way. Once he reached Propoysk, he could cross the Soj River and achieve relative safety in case he was the target of the whole Russian force. Battle. The Russians gathered their forces to attack the Swedes in the rear as they were crossing the stream of Lesnyanka at the village of Lesnaya, to march south against Propoysk in order to reach safety by crossing the river of Soj. Thousands of wagons made for slow progress and bottlenecks, and the scattered Swedish army was by then very vulnerable to Russian attacks. Subsequently, Peter I took the advantage and pressed home the assault. His forces included 26,000 Russian regulars, 5,000 dragoons under Christian Felix Bauer at Berezovka, 8,000 infantry under Verdun at Patskovo, and an irregular force of estimated 2,500 to 5,000 Cossacks and Kalmyks in total. Peter had close to 30,000 men against Lewenhaupt. When the attack began, more than half of the Swedish army had crossed the Lesnyanka stream. They numbered about 12,000 men in 17 battalions, with more than 4,500 wagons in a train. Russian advance. Peter I split his force of 13,000 regulars into two columns. The right under himself with Mikhail Mikhailovich Golitsyn assisting, and the left under General Alexander Menshikov. The two columns marched toward the middle field between the northern and southern forest fringes. Lewenhaupt's army was behind the southern fringe and Peter I attacked from the north. Menshikov's force traversed 2 kilometers of road while Peter I struggled to penetrate 3 kilometers of dense forest. Excluding officers, at least 18,000 Russian regulars including Bauer's dragoon force would engage during the battle, with 2,500 minus 5,000 irregulars. In total, 22,000 to 25,000 engaged. Lewenhaupt initially had around 4,500 men on the northern side of the Lesnyanka stream to receive the initial attack. his other forces having crossed the stream in marching towards Propoysk. However, as the battle raged, he was able to obtain reinforcements and reach a total fighting force of around 9,000 men against the Russians. At least 2,900 men were ordered to protect and maintain the baggage convoy. A Swedish outpost had also been placed on the middle field, consisting of no more than 3 battalions, to warn of and stall a possible Russian attack. This is where the 2 columns of Peter I marched. Fighting at the outpost around 1000, October 9, 1708, the battle began. Peter I's column under Menshikov had reached the middle field from the northwest, finding the 900 Swedes deployed there. Unfortunately for Menshikov, the commander of the heavily outnumbered Swedish outpost, Lieutenant Colonel Freiberg, seized the initiative and launched a Karelian-style surprise attack which threw the Russian column into confusion, while the sudden musket and cannon fire alerted the nearby main Swedish force. After this initial success, the Swedes were forced to retreat with many wounded through the southern fringe of the forest, where they were relieved by 5 fresh battalions under the command of Bernd Otto Stackelberg, which had marched from Lesnaya. Meanwhile, Tsar Peter's right column had reached the crossroads and traversed the marshes of Kriv, just south of the middle field, close to where Menshikov's column had been in action, having Peter to their left flank and Menshikov to the front. Stackelberg's 5 Swedish battalions were now fighting 2 Russian columns numbering 13,000 in all. 6 other Swedish battalions were on their way to the battle zone. The Russians at the crossroads under Peter were almost routed by the Swedes and could have faced a crushing defeat, had not the Russian guards halted their advance. The fighting at the crossroads surged back and forth. The Russian line was strengthened by 6 artillery pieces. However, the Swedes, who themselves had no artillery in this particular fight, were able to capture 4 of them and block Peter's progress at the Kriv Bridge. Swedish withdrawal at little past 1100, facing the Swedish right flank at the middle field. Menshikov's guardsmen executed a successful flanking maneuver, forcing the 5 Swedish battalions to retreat into the southern fringe of the forest and prepare to receive the expected Russian onslaught. Their departure left unguarded a bridge near the crossroads, leaving it clear for Russian troops to march out and form up en masse. Thus trapped in a pincer movement, hemmed in and outnumbered, Stackelberg, against the wishes of Lewenhaupt, ordered an orderly withdrawal. The 6 Swedish battalions which were yet to arrive on their march through the forest, were also ordered to retreat, an action which isolated and exposed Halsing's 2nd Battalion, which had previously routed the Russians and now came close to being annihilated by them. Lewenhaupt came under attack by Russian dragoons who swept eastward through the southern fringe of the forest and headed for the Swedish dragoons, deployed east of Lesnaya. On the open field, the Russians had some success at first, but as soon as the main bulk of the Swedish cavalry arrived and charged in typical Karelian wedge formation, the Russian cavalry was being repulsed and quickly broke. Tsar Peter with his Russian infantry and dragoons had now pushed away the last retreating Swedes and had full control over the southern forest edge. The Russians now strove to reach the Lesnaya field between the forest and the village of Lesnaya, to block the bridge over which the Swedes might obtain further reinforcements. A Swedish counter-offensive to push the Russians out of the forest was now ordered by Lewenhaupt, who had been very disappointed by Stackelberg's decision to retreat. The Swedes counter-attacked with the support of 16 artillery pieces from Lesnaya. However, the Russian troops, backed by their own 30 cannons, were too strong and the Swedes had to fall back. Pause in hostilities. The Swedes retreated almost to the village of Lesnaya and the Russians followed them to the adjacent open terrain, intending to launch a decisive attack from there. However, both sides being exhausted by the day's intense combat, hostilities were ceased at about 1500 when, separated by only 150 to 200 meters, The two sides sank down on the field facing each other, and rested. During this extraordinary interlude, in which only 3 Russian cannons sounded off, the two armies distributed food, water and ammunition to their ranks, issued orders and deployed reinforcements in preparation for the final conflict. Somehow during this remarkable phase, the Russian general Friedrich von Hessen-Darmstadt was shot and mortally wounded as he rode back and forth in a provocative manner between the two armies. He died of his wounds 4 days later. The hour-long pause concluded at about 1600, with the arrival, after a long march, of Bauer's company of 4,000 Russian dragoons. Fighting at Lesnaya at a little past 1600, the Swedes opened fire, with cannons positioned 600 meters from the southern forest edge, on the newly arrived dragoons, who were then attaching themselves to the Russians' left flank. The open terrain gave the Swedish army opportunity to closely coordinate its infantry and cavalry, an advantage which they gratefully seized. Repeatedly, Russian front-line troops retreated from infantry Garpar shock attacks only to find themselves under immediate attack from the rear by Swedish cavalry. However, this could only be a temporary advantage in view of the Russian reserve strength, reportedly 3 battalions deep by this time, enabling an irresistible grinding advance. The Russian right flank under Mikhail Mikhailovich Golitsyn moved to secure the Sol bridge across the Lesnyanka in order to prevent the flow of Swedish reinforcements across it, while seeking to trap them with their backs to the river. However, the bridge was ferociously defended and the Russians were beaten off, suffering heavy losses. At this time, both sides were inconvenienced by a snowstorm, a rare event for early October, even in Russia. At 1700, Lewenhaupt ordered a concerted attack which, however, was blunted by a tactic of continuous fire which the Russians had devised to counter the Swedish Garpar onslaught. The Swedes took heavy casualties and were driven further back towards the village. Their line was also split in two, one side against the Lesnaya and the other against the forest to the west. The all-important bridge was on the brink of being taken when it was saved by the arrival of 900 Swedish dragoons from across the river, whose fierce onslaught drove the Russians back. At 1900, when night fell, the Russians left the field and drew back to the forest fringe. The Swedes stood in their battle formations for several hours, expecting a night attack which did not come.